In the Blue Mountains of Australia, dozens of tourists disappear without a trace every year. This ancient forest, the size of a small country, is full of treacherous gorges, and thick fog turns familiar paths into deadly traps. Local rescuers call it the Green Labyrinth of Death. In July of that year, Jamie Neal from London decided to take a stroll along the route to the ruined castle without any navigation or communication devices. His story would shock the world, divide public opinion, and destroy a family. But the most shocking part of it is not what happened in the forest, but what happened afterward. Jamie Neal grew up in Muswell Hill, a green suburb of North London, where the biggest adventure was considered a trip to the city centre without parents. At 19 years old, he stood on the threshold of adult life with a ticket to the University of Exeter in his pocket and a spot on the politics faculty reserved for October. His mother, Jean, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. His father, Richard, lived separately after the divorce but regularly called his son and took an interest in his life. In the spring of 2009, Jamie passed his final exams and faced the classic choice of a British graduate: dive straight into university routine or take a gap year. That very gap year which had become a national tradition. The decision came quickly, and by June he was packing his backpack, assuring his mother that he would stay in touch regularly. Australia beckoned with the perfect balance of the familiar and the exotic. English language, left-hand driving, tea with milk in cafes, but also kangaroos, coral reefs, and endless expanses where one could get lost in the good sense of the word. On June 22nd, Jamie landed in Sydney with a plan to spend a few weeks in the country and then move on through Asia. The budget was modest, but for a 19-year-old guy ready for hostel life and noodle meals, this amount seemed enough for months of endless adventures. The morning of July 3, 2009, started perfectly. In Katoomba, a mountain town 100 kilometers from Sydney, the winter sun broke through the eucalyptus haze, creating that very bluish tint that gave the name to the entire region. Waking up in the hostel around 7, Jamie had breakfast with toast and jam and began getting ready. The route to the ruined castle was considered a classic, 14 kilometers round trip, accessible to anyone in decent shape. His gear was ridiculously simple: jeans, a t-shirt, a light jacket, and a small backpack where he put 2 rolls and a half-empty bottle of water. Everything valuable, mobile phone, passport, credit card, remained in the hostel. In the lobby, there were free laminated maps on the counter, and next to them hung a board for registering hikes. Jamie glanced at them and walked past. In Epping Forest near London, where he often walked, there was no such bureaucracy. At 9:40, he set out on the trail. The guests saw him walking to a whistled melody, and later recalled that Jamie looked confident, as if heading for a walk in the park. He ignored the warning at the entrance about the need to take water and warm clothing. The first hour, the path went through dense eucalyptus forest, where the air was filled with a spicy scent and the cries of kookaburras, resembling ominous laughter. At the fork in the trails, Jamie saw a sign for Mount Solitary. The name sounded romantic, and the distance of 16 kilometers didn't seem excessive for a person in good shape. Why not continue further? The day was long, the weather excellent, and the mood upbeat. Those few seconds of deliberation at the fork. A simple decision by a young man in a good mood. Jamie didn't know that in the Blue Mountains, every turn could be the last, and confidence in one's own abilities is the most dangerous illusion. The trail to Mount Solitary led through the ridge, and for the first 2 hours, Jamie moved confidently, following the orange markers on the trees. By noon, he reached the rock formation ruined castle, where he met a couple of tourists from Germany. They exchanged pleasantries, and the Germans, leaving, warned that further on, the trail becomes less obvious. Jamie just nodded confidently. After all, he had basic training and knew how to read the terrain. After the ruined castle, the forest seemed to start claiming the trail for itself. The clear line quickly turned into a barely noticeable strip of trampled grass, and then dissolved altogether. The markings disappeared. Confident that he was going in the right direction, Jamie began an unnoticed descent into the valley. The slope became steeper, forcing him to cling to branches to avoid falling. Around 2 p.m., he stopped. Around him was dense, unfamiliar forest without a single sign of civilization. The attempt to return along his own tracks failed. The slope he had descended looked completely different from below. Every tree resembled its neighbor. Every stone seemed familiar and alien at the same time. It was then that the first cold touch of panic gripped him. He was lost. The alarm began on the morning of July 4th. The hostel administrator became worried when the British guy from room 12 not only didn't show up the day before, but also didn't appear for the excursion he had paid for. Checking the room only confirmed the worst fears. The passport left on the nightstand, the phone on charge, and the untouched backpack all indicated that he intended to return. By noon, the Katoomba police began an investigation. Questioning the guests quickly revealed that Jamie had gone toward the trails to the ruined castle. Checking his bank account confirmed no activity since the morning of July 3rd. On July 6th, a call from Sydney caught his mother Jean Neal on duty at the hospital. A distant Australian accent, a cold official tone, and the pronounced name of her son. That was enough for her world to shake. Half an hour later, they called his father Richard too. For the first time in years, the divorced spouses spoke to each other without the previous hostility, united by a common misfortune. Richard flew to Sydney on the first flight. Ahead of him were 30 hours of travel with layovers, each minute of which seemed like an eternity. At that very time, in the Blue Mountains, one of the largest search operations was already unfolding. By July, the number of participants had grown to 100 people. Police, rescuers, firefighters, and dozens of volunteers combed the forest. A helicopter circled over the valley, and below, search dogs picked up the scent. While they searched for him, Jamie desperately fought for his life just a few kilometers from the rescuers, separated from them by an impassable wall of forest. Already by the evening of the first day, he ran out of water, and the tormenting thirst forced him to listen to the sounds of nature in search of the saving gurgle. In the end, he stumbled upon a narrow stream at the bottom of a ravine and drank straight from it, not thinking about the consequences. Food ran out even faster. The 2 rolls were eaten on the first day, and by the third, the hunger became unbearable. Recalling basic survival lessons, he began looking for inconspicuous neutral-colored plants, avoiding anything bright that might be poisonous. His finds were bitterish seeds of local orchids and leaves resembling arugula, which turned out to be wild spinach. Every day was a new attempt to get out. Jamie climbed to a height in hopes of seeing landmarks, but saw only endless forest in all directions. Descending, he lost the way again, and with each such circle, his strength slowly left him. On the 5th day, hope appeared. He heard the sound of a helicopter. Jamie shouted and waved his jacket, but the machine, without noticing him, flew away. By the 10th day, Jamie stopped counting time, fully immersed in the struggle for survival. Confident that the end was near, he took out the notebook he always carried with him and began writing farewell letters in small handwriting. He wrote to his mother that he loved her and asked forgiveness for all the worry. To his father, that he always appreciated his care despite the divorce. To friends, that his death was not a heroic act but just a stupid accident. But on the 11th day, fate took away even this last consolation. Crossing another stream, he slipped on a wet stone. The bag slipped off his shoulder and in an instant disappeared in the flow of water, carrying away the notebook and camera, his last words to loved ones and last shots of the journey. It was that evening, devastated and deprived of his last connection to the world, that Jamie first thought about simply giving up. The physical suffering receded into the background. The cold no longer chilled to the bone, and hunger turned into a dull, monotonous pain. It seemed there was nothing left to fight for, but some primal force, whether remnants of hope or simple instinct, forced him to move on. But this instinct had to fight alone. In the official documents of the search operation, July 12th was already circled in red. The next day, July 13th, was intended not for searches but for preparing the final report and press release about terminating the work. July 12th, 6 a.m. at the search operation headquarters in Katoomba, Assistant Police Commissioner Dennis Clifford studied the map with marked search zones. Red shaded the checked areas, yellow those passed only once, green the untouched. Red was becoming more and more, but Jamie was nowhere. Clifford knew the statistics. After 10 days in the forest without gear, the chances of finding a person alive approach zero. But officially winding down the operation was too early. Too much resonance, too much media attention. At that same morning, 8 kilometers from the headquarters, Jamie woke up under a fallen tree where he had spent the night. The temperature at night dropped to 2 degrees. His jeans were soaked with dew. The attempt to stand caused dizziness. His body no longer obeyed as before. Every movement required conscious effort. In his head swirled fragments of memories. His mom's voice when she woke him for school. The smell of Sunday roast. The last party with friends before departure, where everyone wished luck and joked not to get lost in the Australian outback. The irony of that joke now burned his consciousness stronger than the icy cold. Jamie began talking to himself, just to hear a human voice. He counted steps, retold movie plots, recalled the names of all classmates. Anything to keep his mind from slipping into darkness. Breakfast consisted of a handful of orchid seeds and a few leaves of wild spinach. The bitterness was no longer felt. The taste buds had dulled. More important was finding water. Yesterday's stream had dried up. He needed to find a new one. Jamie crawled more than walked, clinging to roots and stones. Around noon, he found a puddle in a rock depression. Water the color of tea with floating leaves and insects. A week ago, he wouldn't have touched it. Now he drank greedily, trying not to think about the consequences. His stomach cramped almost immediately, but he managed to keep the water inside. Helicopters flew every day, sometimes so low that Jamie saw the pilots' faces, shouted until hoarse, waved his jacket, which had turned from blue to gray from dirt. Once a helicopter hovered right above him, began descending. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, momentarily drowning out all other sounds. But the machine turned and flew away. The pilot didn't see him through the dense tree crowns. Richard Cass in those days hardly slept at all. Based in a hotel in Katoomba, every morning he came to the search headquarters. The rescuers looked at him with sympathy but averted their eyes. And in this silence hung what no one dared to say aloud. Richard himself understood everything, but his mind refused to accept it. Instead, he studied maps, suggested new search zones, argued with coordinators about routes. In London, Jean Neal didn't leave the phone. Colleagues at the hospital covered her shifts, understanding she couldn't work. Every morning she called the consulate, every evening Richard. At night she didn't sleep, sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea, staring at Jamie's photo on the fridge. That very one where he smiles after receiving the Duke of Edinburgh award certificate. Neighbors brought food, which she didn't touch. She prayed for the first time in 20 years, although she stopped believing in God after her mother's death. In the evening of July 12th, she called Richard. Her voice trembled, but she tried to hold on, asked if there was news.
Richard Lied
said the searches were progressing, that there were leads. She thanked him for being there, close to their son. For the first time in years after the divorce, there was no reproach in her voice. The clear and cold morning of July 13th brought Richard Cass the same cold clarity. He got up earlier than usual and, without saying a word to anyone, headed to the edge of the national park. This was his personal last ritual. He chose a spot with a view of the silent Jameson Valley, which had swallowed his son. Down there was Jamie, alive or dead, but already forever remaining in this forest. With trembling hands, Richard took out a knife and carved 2 words and a date on the bark of a eucalyptus tree. Jamie Neal, 2009. Then, breaking his nails on the hard ground, he dug a hole, placed a red rose there, and pressed it with a stone. He didn't pray, he just stood and let go of his son. The news waiting for him at headquarters was only the official confirmation of what he had already come to terms with. Mass searches were ceasing. The superintendent's silent handshake said everything without words. That same day, Richard booked a ticket to London. There was no point in staying. He needed to return to the heavy duties, organize a memorial, support Jean, and force himself to live on in a world where his son no longer existed. July 14th, Jamie woke up with the understanding that this might be his last day. Although his strength was almost exhausted, and every movement came with incredible effort, it was this morning that brought a strange clarity of thought that comes on the edge between life and death. If he stayed in place, death was inevitable. If he moved, there was a microscopic chance. He stood up, using the tree as support, and for some time just stood, gathering his spirit. In his head flashed the promise given to his mother before departure. Her request to take care of himself. This memory, simple and ordinary, became the thread he clung to. He chose a direction at random, just down the slope, following the logic of water. Streams flow to rivers, rivers to populated places. Primitive logic, but there was no other. His progress turned into a torturous cycle. Every step came through force, and falls became an integral part of the movement. Fall, rise with difficulty, take a few steps, and collapse to the ground again. Knees and palms bled, but the pain was no longer felt. The body worked on some basic level of survival beyond ordinary sensations. By noon, he came out onto something resembling a trail. At first, he didn't believe his eyes, thought it was another hallucination from exhaustion. But no, it was a real trail with trampled earth, clearly walked by people. His heart skipped a beat, but there was no strength to rejoice, only dull hope that this wasn't a mirage. He walked along the trail, staggering like a drunk, periodically falling and rising again. After an hour that seemed like eternity, the trail led to a wide dirt road, a fire break. Jamie fell to his knees in the middle of the road. Realizing this was the first sign of civilization in 12 days. He crawled to the roadside and sat, leaning against a tree trunk. If someone passed or drove by, they would see him. If not, at least he would die on the road, not in the thicket. The sun was setting, and Jamie dozed off sitting, slipping into a strange state between sleep and wakefulness. In this half-delirium, he heard voices. Ben Lowry and his girlfriend Michelle set out for a morning walk along the Narrow Neck Fire Trail around 10:30 in the morning. They lived in the Shire district south of Sydney and often went to the Blue Mountains on weekends. They knew this route well, had walked it dozens of times. The weather was perfect for a hike. Sunny, cool, no wind. On the 3rd kilometer of the trail, Michelle noticed something strange on the roadside. At first, she thought it was a pile of old clothes. Then she saw it was a person, sitting, leaning against a tree, head bowed to chest. Ben ran up first, touched the shoulder. The person raised his head. The face was overgrown, dirty, with sunken eyes, lips cracked to blood, clothes turned to rags. But the person was alive and conscious. Ben asked, "Are you okay?" A stupid question, but no other came to mind. The person answered in a hoarse whisper. At first, Ben didn't make out the words, asked to repeat. "I am Jamie Neal. I got lost 12 days ago." The name seemed familiar. Michelle remembered first. The news, photo in newspapers, mass searches. The British tourist they've been searching for 2 weeks, who was officially declared dead yesterday. Ben took out his mobile phone. The signal was weak but sufficient. He dialed the emergency number, reported the coordinates and the found person's condition. On the other end, they didn't believe at first, asked to repeat the name. After those words, feverish activity began on the other end. Snatches of excited phrases were heard. Michelle gave Jamie water from her bottle. He drank in small sips. His hands shook so much that half spilled. Ben took off his fleece jacket, threw it over Jamie's shoulders. He began to cry, quietly, almost silently. Tears left clean tracks on the dirty face. The rescue team arrived in 40 minutes. Medics checked vital signs, set up and 4 right on the spot. Jamie could walk with support, which was a good sign. They led him to the ambulance waiting at the nearest accessible point for transport. At 12:30 on July 15th, a call came to the search operation headquarters. The duty officer couldn't believe his ears, asked twice, then shouted to the whole headquarters. They found him alive. In Sydney Airport, Richard Cass was waiting to board the flight to London. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost hung up, but something made him press the green button. "Mr. Cass, this is Katoomba Police. We have incredible news. We found him. We found Jamie." The world spun. Richard sat right on the floor in the waiting hall. People turned around, but he didn't care. The police helicopter delivered him back to Katoomba. Just 3 hours ago, he had said goodbye to his son forever. Now he was flying to meet him alive, injured, exhausted, but alive. The world was preparing for morning news. Instead, it got a sensation. But the price of this miracle would be higher than anyone could imagine. Blue Mountains Hospital in Katoomba. Jamie lay on white sheets connected to N4. Nurses fussed around, checking indicators. Body temperature 35 degrees, pulse rapid, blood pressure low. Classic signs of severe hypothermia and dehydration, but vital signs were not threatened. The doctors were confident the guy would survive. Richard entered the ward around 3 p.m., stopped at the door, not daring to come closer. Jamie turned his head, tried to smile. The father crossed the room in 3 steps and finally hugged his son, whom he had considered dead that morning. Jamie seemed almost weightless to him, just bones under the hospital pajamas. But the calm was short-lived. By evening, journalists began flocking to the hospital. First local, then national channels. The miraculous rescue was turning into a media sensation. And this swarm of reporters at the entrance was only its first wave. The story of the miraculous rescue of the British tourist flew across the continent. The hospital administration posted security, but the reporters were persistent. Cameras filmed everyone entering and exiting, and microphones reached out to anyone in medical uniform. On July 17th, Jamie was discharged from the hospital. After 2 days under observation, rehydration, and a sparing diet, the doctors were amazed at the speed of his recovery. The only restriction was a ban on air travel for 6 weeks due to air pockets found in his lungs. Consequences of severe hypothermia. At the exit, a crowd was already waiting. Camera flashes, a forest of microphones, shouts of questions. Having lost 10 kilograms, with a grown beard in borrowed clothes, Jamie bewilderedly waved his hand, trying to smile. Security barely managed to lead him through the ring of reporters to the car. In the hotel, a man in an expensive suit was waiting for them, a producer of the 60 Minutes Australia program. The offer was simple and stunning. Exclusive interview about survival for 200,000 Australian dollars. For a guy whose recent dinner was a handful of bitter seeds, this amount seemed unreal. And Jamie hesitated. Something inside him, not yet recovered from the experienced horror, resisted the idea of turning his pain into a TV show. But the producer was persuasive. He said the story would be told anyway. So isn't it better to control the narrative himself? Plus, it's a chance to thank the rescuers by donating part of the money. The arguments were weighty and the temptation huge. By evening of the same day, the contract was signed. Shooting was scheduled for tomorrow, broadcast for the day after. Later, Jamie told his father he would share the money, giving half to him in gratitude for the support. Richard hugged his son with the words that money doesn't matter. After all, the main thing is he's alive. The interview was recorded for 3 hours. Jamie relived everything. Losing the trail, water from puddles, farewell notes carried away by the river. He showed his emaciated hands and cuts on his legs, while the camera impassively captured every detail. The producers were thrilled. This would be a sensation. The interview aired on July 19th and broke all records. But instead of the expected sympathy, a wave of public criticism crashed on Jamie. On radio broadcasts, the question that concerned many sounded: why should taxpayers, who paid for the rescue operation costing over $100,000, watch as the guy who got lost due to his own stupidity earns a fortune from it? Letters demanding that Jamie return the money to the state flew to editors. Police attempts to stop the wave of indignation were unsuccessful. Superintendent Anthony McWhorter convened a press conference where he confirmed the authenticity of the story, providing medical data and witness statements, but it no longer mattered. Public opinion had rendered its verdict. From a survival hero, Jamie turned into a calculating opportunist, and on July 27th, the main scandal erupted, this time a family one. Richard Cass gave an interview to the Australian channel ABC, in which he publicly accused his son of deceit. He claimed they had agreed to split the fee in half, but Jamie, barely receiving the contract, reneged on his words. Richard's words were full of pain and resentment. He told how he spent his last savings on the flight, how for 2 weeks he lived in a hotel and didn't work, waiting for news, and now the son, for whom he did all this, turned away from him because of money. His phrase, "The son I found is not the son I flew for," instantly became a headline in all tabloids. Jamie's response was cold and formal, voiced through a representative. He stated that he would not participate in public squabbles with his father, as their relationship is a family matter. Regarding the money, he only clarified that a significant part of the amount would be transferred to the rescue services. But it was already too late. The story split society into two camps. Some defended Jamie, believing he deserved compensation for the hell he went through. Others sympathized with the father who dropped everything for his son. The media reveled in this drama, every day adding fuel to the fire with new accusations and refutations. August 2009. Jamie quietly, without announcements, returned to London. At Heathrow Airport, no one met him. His mother waited at home, his father no longer called. Their reconciliation didn't happen then or years later. In October, as planned, he began studies at the University of Exeter, an ordinary student among hundreds of others. When someone rarely recognized him and asked about that story, he only answered briefly and changed the topic. The money from the interview was enough for tuition and a modest life. Part of the amount was indeed transferred to the rescue services, although, as they say, less than promised. The exact figures remained unknown. In 2013, Richard Cass published his book Ruined Castle. In it was his version of events, his pain and his truth. Jamie never commented on it, nor did he write his own. Jamie himself never gave interviews about those 12 days again. In rare public remarks, he said only one thing: survival is not heroism, but simply a desperate unwillingness to die, and that the wilderness taught him more than any university. But the main lesson he learned after the rescue, realizing that sometimes getting out of the forest is only the beginning of the real trials. Such an incredible and instructive story of Jamie Neal. A story about how sometimes the most difficult trial awaits not in the wild nature, but among people. What do you think about this? Did he do the right thing by taking money for the interview? And whose side in this conflict do you take? The son's or the father's? Write your opinion in the comments. It will be very interesting to read. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episodes.